All right, so today we are talking about the Spanish and French colonization. Now we're going to look at the Spanish first. And the Spanish had really two phases to their colonization. The first was with the Conquistadors. And the Conquistadors, it was a very specific way of setting up how they were going to colonize and conquer territory. I mean, a conquistador essentially is conqueror. I remember they had been set up and used in the past with the Reconquista. So you already had them, essentially they were already there. You had the Reconquista. And so you already had this soldier set up ready to go. And the reason that they wanted to use the conquistadors is because this essentially cost the Spanish crown less. How the system worked was essentially that a conquistador was an individual rather than a group, and that they specifically took up a private expedition. And so with a private expedition, what this meant is that they had to they had to pay their way. They had to pay for the costs associated with traveling. And of course, remember at this point, it's extremely expensive. It's not cheap to sail over to the New World, and you're having to the expenses here, right? So it's travel, it's your equipment. If you want to bring over other men and they aren't paying for their own way, supplies. I mean, the cost gets up there. But the idea was that they finance their own way. They have to pay for basically the right to be able to do this and get over. And then what would happen is because they paid for their own way, they got a percentage of what they plundered essentially from the lands that they conquered. So a percentage of, we'll call it loot, went to the conquistador, and a percentage went to the crown. And the reality is that most could not finance it all on their own with their own money. So a percentage went back to paying the loan or loans that they got to travel. So you had this is important because this system essentially sets up a system of colonization where you are encouraged to loot and plunder, right? Because you have to make back your money, and the people that were going, because they have to make all this money back. It's expensive, and they took out loans. The goal, if you're looking at the goal for, why are they going? The goal was, of course, well, there's two reasons essentially: to make money and to ideally increase your rank in society when you returned to Spain, which tells us a lot about the purpose and structure of what was going on, because if this is, they weren't, the Spanish initial colonization, they did not plan to make it their new home. And we'll see this is a clear difference between the English is the English. The earliest were not there necessarily to make it their new home either, but soon after, people moved there to live there. But the Spaniards, this wasn't the purpose. The conquistadors were usually men of what was called the Hidalgo rank, and this was essentially middle nobility. So they were nobility, but they weren't upper nobility. So they do have means, but they're not super wealthy. And the goal, right, is to move to upper nobility, which you're doing through loot and plunder and conquering. And it encourages ruthlessness. It encourages essentially the ability to go do what they want in order to hopefully improve their life. And the fact that you're not planning on staying there means, as far as the long-term consequences of what you're doing to the native population, is irrelevant in their eyes, because they're going to be back. They're not going to have to deal with the consequences long term. They're not planning to make a life there. These were largely younger men, unmarried men. So they were young enough that they weren't married yet, they weren't tied down, and they were looking to advance. Essentially, very ambitious individuals willing to gamble, because this was a gamble. There was no guarantee that you were going to make a lot of money. So a gamble to increase status and wealth. It was a very expensive gamble. They said that put them under essentially finance through loans and family members and extreme pressure, right, to make the money back. This meant, of course, that plunder, slavery, killing, destruction, all were going to be okay, because this was, I guess the ends justify the means, essentially, that you did what you needed to do to move up in rank. And then, because you weren't planning on making it your new home, I guess you could say that there was no worry of consequence. So this certainly did create a much more brutal system than other, even compared to the English system of colonization and the problems and issues that emerged between them and the natives. The Spanish structure with conquistadors created a much more brutal system that was encouraged by the system to maintain that brutality and plunder and rape and looting, because there wasn't accountability. You don't have a local government. So within that early structure, no organized government. Essentially, each conquistador was in charge, and then of his men, if he had them, if they weren't individually financing their way as well. Outside of that, though, you didn't have oversight by all, and the crown didn't have to risk their money on it, but made money from the percentage and the requirement that they did with this. Now, the best example of this, which also just spurred this on further, is, we'll put over here, it's still conquistadors, but what is Hernan Cortes. Hernan Cortes probably becomes the most famous conquistador and most well known because he ends up conquering the Aztecs. Oops, look at this wrong thing here. There had been rumors that no, let me start. Oh, gosh. Sorry about that. It always feels like it freezes when it says it's supposed to be resuming. Okay, so there have been rumors that of this place that was full of riches. When Cortes, he went with, ended up getting 600 armed volunteers. They had actually had a different planned mission that he was going to do. There was the governor of Cuba had organized the conquistadors to occasionally do missions, and instead as he and his men were making their way around the area, conquering and taking, they began to hear stories of this large city with untold riches. And intrigued by this, they ended up going to the coast of Mexico and pushed to the Central Valley to find the Aztecs. And how he did so, there's a variety of ways. One of the things, of course, is he used a ton of different tactics for being successful. One of the things, of course, is that they had disease on the hand, and Cortes and other conquistadors certainly took advantage of that and claimed they could control it. So the idea was, help us or we make you sick. And so you got some people to various local individuals to help navigate and continue to be interpreters and everything else, because essentially what he did is say, if you help us, we spare you. Other type of diplomacy, although often fake diplomacy in the sense of making promises and then breaking them. They rarely followed through. And then general force, destructiveness. And then the last thing that actually really helped as well is that other people hated the Aztecs. So if you were forced with the decision of, we can destroy you, or you can help us find the Aztecs, people actually, the subjects of the Aztecs, kind of were like, ooh, you don't want us. We really, we don't have the riches you're wanting. You want big riches. Look, I got just the place for you. They're over there. And kind of happily went along with it. The reason why, so the Aztec Empire was massive. Their main city, the capital, had a population of over 200,000 people, which dwarfed the size of, so it's the Aztecs, dwarfed the size of any Spanish city at the time. So this was massive. The largest Spanish city was around 70,000. So this is an impressive feat. How the king and the Aztec Empire managed to control and have such a large wealth, because essentially you had the city and then you had outlying city-states and territories that were what would be called tribute states. And they were conquered by the Aztecs. And then they had to pay money to them. Then they also used control through sacrifices. And what was this? So not only did you have to pay money to the Aztec Empire to not utterly destroy you, but you had to give a certain number of people over to sacrifices. And the Aztec religion, so it was very similar to the Mayan religion, but they used it in a much more forceful, brutal way, if you will. But one of the main key components was they believed in blood sacrifice to appease the gods. And there were two ways. There's bloodletting, and then there was human sacrifice. And the Aztecs, bloodletting was done by the priest and the king, and they had an obligation to do so. You took spiked rope, and you would run it through either your tongue or genitals, because they're two of the most sensitive spots, and then the blood, you would collect the blood, and that would be a blood sacrifice for the gods. With human sacrifice, you cut out the heart of the victim alive, which would be quite painful, not pleasant whatsoever. So what ends up happening is, well, they did do bloodletting, and like I said, this was done, the king and priest had a responsibility to do this. The king used human sacrifice as a method of control and a show of power. And essentially, you had these tributary states that they didn't want to get annihilated, because the Aztec city was so large and their empire strong, and they could bring in any of the other tributary states to control it. You had to give people to be killed. And they made certain representatives and individuals come watch on a regular basis to watch these sacrifices, essentially under the guise of religion. And then under the guise of religion, they essentially killed your people in a very kind of brutal way. And they did other things. So then when they conquered people, the men that were captured, they had the army use them for target practice. The other things that they did was this idea of where you had a person and you painted where their heart was to avoid it, and then you had them run around while an individual shot them with arrows in a field, and the belief was as the blood then leaked out, it fertilized the ground and appeased the gods and helped with farming. I mean, so they had a ton of different brutal tactics for killing, injuring, and maiming people. The main sacrifice one, though, was meant to be as a show of force and control. So people obviously didn't like them. They were brutal, they were violent, and most of the tributary states weren't particularly happy to be under them, but didn't really have a choice. And so when Cortes shows up and is, threatening to conquer them and kill them, and demanding information, they were, all too happy to say, here are the Aztecs. So when they show up, they actually they don't just immediately start attacking. In fact, they were seen, and they would have looked impressive and foreign to the Aztecs, because they would have been on the horses, they would have had the armor on, they had loud guns. They weren't very accurate or even that useful, but they're loud and impressive. So they were actually invited into the Aztec city. And the king, Moctezuma, did a tactic with them. There were two ways that he did it, was conquer and crush, essentially destroy you, or impress and provide wealth, right? And these were both seen as ways to subdue groups. If the group was seen as strong and he didn't think it was worth a fight or there was potential loss, this is what they did. And so this is what they did with Cortes and his men. They invited them into the city, showed them and showed them all of, essentially they got a tour and saw the wealth and power of the Aztecs. That was the point. Right? And then with one of these, and it did impress them. Like I said, it was huge. Cortes actually even said Spain has nothing to compare with it. And one of the things they showed them, which was again meant to show their force and strength, was they showed them sacrifices, human sacrifices. Well, they were planning on taking this place anyways, but they used this to justify conquering it. Now they had an advantage, right? Because they were already inside. So they attacked one evening from inside and tried to take it that way. They put the king in put the king in chains. This shows you how impressive it is, though, as far as the Aztecs as it is, because they were able to fight them off and remove them from the city. So you have an inside attack, essentially. And they ended up technically not being successful. So what they did is they decided to wait for reinforcements. Right? They sent a thing and waited for reinforcements. In the meantime, what helped them with this, because you're trying to conquer a city with over 200,000 people just in the city alone. The capital here, I'll put the name for you here. Which I mean, so if you have, it's say, 600 men against, and not all 200,000 are fighting capability, but the main upper class was warriors of the Aztec group. I mean, this is pretty ballsy. How are you actually successful? It wasn't because of their fighting prowess alone. Of course, it was because of disease. As they waited for reinforcements, of course, they had transmitted some diseases that the Aztecs didn't have immunities to, and this ended up wiping out a large portion of the population, or making them, if not dead, it weakened them as well. It still took, with reinforcements, 2 months of fighting to take the city. And that's with a severely decreased population and weakened community. Once they had taken it, they tortured the nobles for information, executed them as traitors to the throne, and branded the remaining captives, and then basically kind of tore down the capital, down the city, and rebuilt over the ruins. So what this gets Cortes, right, is F here. What it gets Cortes is he ends up getting all the wealth from the Aztec Empire. But more importantly, he also ends up using those tributary states to say, we won't conquer you, but you have to pay me money. And he ends up becoming extremely wealthy. I'm sure, of course, it's great for the crown, too, because they get a percentage. But there's rumors, of course, that he actually ended up becoming more powerful or more wealthy than the king and queen of Spain. And, of course, this created a domino effect. Spain of more conquistadors wanting to go. So this, you end up having more conquistadors show up, and they're most were not going to be able to replicate even close to what Cortes did, and many weren't even able to make back their money. But it of course encourages continued and increased brutality. The biggest by far of all of the Spanish for the conquistadors of being successful. The next would probably be Francisco Pizarro. Just put him. We're not gonna go into him completely. But he ends up taking on the Inca Empire. But other than that, you don't really know about too many of the conquistadors, because the reality is they weren't as successful. And they managed maybe to make enough to go back and move up the ranks. Maybe they don't. But the majority weren't like Hernan Cortes, but certainly his story and his legend propelled the conquistadors on. Now, with all this brutality, with all the violent system, you had two things going on. One is that the Spanish crown wanted a more involved role, in part because they saw the wealth that was there. The system of independent soldiers was not, you don't make an empire out of semi-autonomous soldiers, right? They weren't held accountable to being, following Spanish rule per se. The other big issue, and of course, part of colonization, if you're wanting, we talked about this before, the idea of colonization and having it be that the Spanish crown wanted it to be permanent, right? Not this temporary conquest, was that then you transmitted Spanish culture and religion. But they couldn't do that with the conquistadors raping and pillaging everyone. Now, one of the things that the Spanish crown had sent over were friars to transmit, right, religion. And this, of course, was somewhat contrary to the nature of the conquistadors, and made it hard to convert to Christianity with the violence and looting of the conquistadors. And a friar named Bartolome de las Casas ends up writing a paper talking about the violence. So this gets published, writes a paper. He wrote letters too, and letters about the violence and the treatment of Indians. Questions like, what, how can, are they not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not obliged to love them as yourself? He said that a better option was obviously less violence, and they were never going to be able to convert them. This ends up spreading this idea of what was called the Black Legend even further. It had already been around before Bartolome las Casas, but of course it basically, the Black Legend was about the violence and destruction of Spanish conquest, which the Spanish crown was not happy about. This also, of course, then allows for justification for the English to colonize. And what they argued was, and save the Indians. Right? They'll welcome us as liberators. Now, I mean, the English didn't even end up going into Aztec territory, but they used it as justification. One, we need to curb Spanish expansion and the expansion of Catholicism, but we also, this violence, this structure is not okay. And so ultimately, the crown ends up putting restrictions. So this is the second phase of colonization, of Spanish colonization. All right. So the second phase begins to change, which was that the Spanish crown put legislation protecting the Indians from exploitation to a degree, right? Of course. And enslavement, ideally. As well as you couldn't just take land anymore. But the problem was this ended up still being ignored by the conquistadors, who kind of said, well, we don't have to do this. So what happens is that from pressure from population, from the Spanish monarchs and the friars, the Spanish crown eventually shifted the structure of their let's see, the way that they were going to do stuff. What they did is they said, well, they changed it from conquest to pacification, and then said that there was going to actually be a bureaucratic system that was directly basically not only loyal but held accountable to Spain. So they changed to now the idea of actual colonization and establishment of towns. And in these towns, then you had magistrates that were personally selected by the crown, and they started sending people over too, right? So you no longer have, they got rid of the conquistadors, funded and sent people over. The conquistadors had a choice. They could either come home or become governors, magistrates, and follow the rules of the crown. And to enforce this, they sent over lawyers and other bureaucrats to follow Spanish law and hold them accountable. This, what you end up having is actually, so you had all these single men that had come over and, to improve their rank, and many weren't successful. So they weren't going to go home where they were indebted and would, be worse off. And instead, many of the conquistadors that weren't as successful or had, felt that they had anything waiting for them back in Spain, they remained and married local women. And this is a huge difference between, big difference between the English. The English did not marry Native Americans very often, and women came over not right at first, but eventually they came over in large numbers, whereas Spanish women did not travel to settle in the New World. And this creates a whole essentially not caste system, but very, very close. And the caste system essentially was then divided. Essentially was a caste system of racial classification, and which did determine rank and wealth, right? How much Spanish you were versus native versus African American, who some were also brought over as slaves. And they had this chart that was essentially created and each racial group and each group named based on these various percentages and what and how different groups created different offspring, and thus determining your social standing within society. So you had this super hierarchy of racial groups based on Spanish viewpoints. This ends up, from this, they are successful with establishing towns. By 1574 they had 121 towns, and by 1628 they were up to 210. This of course makes, now even more so, the Spanish Empire excessively wealthy. They talk about like how much between, let's see, 1500 to 1650, the Spanish brought back 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver. Then this went back to Spain. This is also going to create problems because the English are going to use this to pirate them, to rob them when the ships are bringing back the wealthy. It also created problems for Spain because, one, it made Spain very rich, but it was essentially this fast influx of money is an artificial, in the sense of how you can't keep it up forever, ended up flooding into Spain, and this creates, as it does with any large inflation, it also created, like I said, other countries basically targeted Spain, and pirates went after the ships that had the gold and silver, and they lost a lot. They brought back a ton, but there were several ships that lost money, and some that they still haven't found. And the reason for the pirating is because essentially the English and French and Dutch, right, they could not compete. They were smaller. Well, they had several things. They were smaller navies, less powerful nations at the time. I mean, it's interesting if you think about it, because of course Spain is going to dwindle as France and England end up way more powerful, even though they started off as the powerhouse. And so you had these pirates that essentially tried to steal as much as they could, sanctioned by the governments. Queen Elizabeth sanctioned pirates to rob the Spanish as much as they possibly could. And the Spanish tried a whole bunch of tactics, because they weighed down these ships with all of this gold and silver. You knew which ships had it. They tried then having decoy ships, but again, still the ship weighed down more lower in the water. They could tell they tried varying up their runs, breaking it into smaller amounts, but it still was super expensive to travel. So you couldn't just break it into tiny little pieces and constantly go back and forth. It was still this massive undertaking, and even this ends up costing Spain a lot of money just to try to get their money back, if you will. This piracy and stuff was essentially a huge problem, and leads actually to the creation of the Spanish Armada and the fight with England, which the Spanish lose, which was just unheard of and stuff. The Spanish Armada was 130 warships. The English had warships, but nothing compared to this. Like, this is crazy that they lost. I'm sure that when they knew that the Spanish Armada, they heard about the Armada and that it was coming for them, it was like, crap, we're so screwed. By luck, what happens is that they end up, having some problems with getting all the warships over there. The weather, they ended up losing several of their ships because of bad weather. So not all of the warships made it to England. That was their first thing that helped them. The second thing was the ones that did show up, the English ships were smaller and faster, and so they were able to break up the Armada and kind of go around them, the ones that were left, and got them into a position that allowed the English swing. Because over half of the ships were destroyed by the time they got to England. Unfathomably, they lost. And this significantly is basically the start of decline in the Spanish Empire. It doesn't happen overnight. They aren't out of the game, but certainly the loss with the Spanish Armada was this kind of tumbling point, if you will, that played a major role. All right, one, I guess, final kind of major loss and defeat that is also important for successful, I think we're on 3 here, Indian revolt was the Pueblo Revolt. There's several things that happened. So one of the start was again in the late around 1570s. The Spanish were wanting to shift to a more normal colonization, if you will, and they tasked Don Juan de Onate with pacifying, as they called it, a New Mexico region where what were called by the Spanish the Pueblo Indians. They were from the Anasazi group, and this was supposed to be a more peaceful structure, but Don Juan was not very peaceful. Essentially, he abused his power and led to fights between the local population that was also supported, and the friars and colonists against Onate and his soldiers. They were actually successful and kicked Onate out, and what was left with the friars and some of the colonists is that you created what became actually standard practice in all throughout and through what was going to become California are Spanish missions. And the friars, and the goal, of course, were to convert to Christianity. The problem is that there was definitely misunderstanding between the Indians and the friars to a degree. Some was also just brutality. But for the Indians, this was a belief that they could convert to a degree, but still maintain old practices and beliefs. Right, where of course the Spanish it was removal of all cultural practices. So, I mean, and this was the idea, you're going to convert to Christianity, then you're going to, speak Spanish, your dress, any cultural, historical practices, food even, right? Again, remember, colonization is the complete and total structure of this. And when these were not followed, when practices not followed, or they were caught, speaking the native language, it was seen by friars as backsliding from Christian beliefs, and they weren't kind about those who became Christians and then didn't follow it. They were beaten, not given food, and other things like that, which of course created tensions and problems. It came to head, though, is that there was a serious drought that emerged during this time in the 1670s, and the prolonged drought, essentially what it did is it united all of the Pueblo people, because the Pueblo people were multiple cities and towns, and they weren't always united. They didn't always agree on stuff. Their identity was usually with each individual city, and basically what it was used was to say that Christianity was a farce and they were being punished because they had abandoned their traditional ways. Right, so the main leader of this was a shaman named Pope, and he led the people, and essentially he basically said his promise was that if they returned to original beliefs and practices and abandoned everything aspect of Spanish culture, then, right, the drought would end. Ultimately, what happened is they encouraged to do so, and they successfully removed the Spanish from their territory. And again here, the only successful Indian revolt that lasted for a while. So for a while, it was 12 years. 12 years, no Spanish. Eventually, though, they kind of went back to their old ways of not being united as a Pueblo people. And of course, Pope's promise was, if you get rid of the Spanish, everything will be good again. And, removing the Spanish did not make everything better. It wasn't like it was perfect before the Spanish either. And certainly they'd come in and changed a lot of systems that once removed made things more difficult. It did last, like I said, for 12 years, but eventually the movement faltered and the Spanish kind of quietly came back in, but with a lot less power. The Spanish take back over eventually, but way more, what we call it, like way more restraint, and working with the Pueblo people. Of course, it was just another example, though, of the Spanish not being fully in control, and you continue to have decline because they were constantly bombarded by other nations wanting to be involved. All right, now we're going to look at French colonization, and this one is going to be a little bit shorter. Kind of just going to do on the key points, because early French colonization, they don't have a lot going on. It was very, very different than the Spanish or the English. Again, each were all different in that sense. The earliest French explorers, like, you know, everyone, they had a goal of, you know, gold and wealth and creating a stronger empire. But ultimately, the French knew to avoid Spanish territory. They knew they couldn't compete, and they didn't want a fight with Spain, so they looked to settle and create, essentially, what they were hoping for was creating what was called a Northwest Passage, right? A sea route connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Where then, of course, it would seem like it would, you know, create a great thing for wealth and whatever else. But they had to deal with the Spanish. They had to deal with pirates. And ultimately, the fact that the territories that they chose didn't have the northern, they did a couple of southern areas too, not a lot of gold. So they shifted their goal, and again, the French crown didn't send massive amounts of people to settle either. Obviously, it was more, the goal was commercial, right? It was money over large settlements. So their goal was never to create permanent places to live. So in that case, like this was like the Spanish, it was mostly men. But the difference was that where they ended up focusing their money was on fur trade and fishing. So this became the French, and they always remained much smaller in size. With this, and the fur trade ends up being this extremely lucrative business that they do make quite a bit of money on. But what you had is fur traders, and fur traders were essentially what was seasonal. So you had much more temporary settlements based on the fur and trade. And if you had smaller sizes, you're not what this does, of course, is you're not going to be, you don't conquer, not going to work to force labor or conquer. And so they had a very different relationship with Native Americans. Essentially, what they're going to largely do is that it's going to focus on trade, right? And working with the Native Americans to actively trade. And if you're looking at smaller sizes, right, because of this, by 1700, and this, 1700, the French, New France, which was one of their permanent locations, only had a population of 19,000. And that was our largest territory. They didn't ultimately want to have large immigration. France didn't want large immigration. Instead, they liked the idea of trading and the money that it brought in that way. So because you had a much smaller white population and they worked with on trade, that the French learned very quickly to be successful, they had to follow local traditions of trade. And because they used the Native Americans to hunt for furs. They did some trapping too, but largely used Native Americans. Now, Native American trade was very different from the concept of trade by Indians, was very different from Europeans. Their view is that trade was a connection of, it wasn't just economics. Sure, there was some economics to it, and relationship. Essentially, trade in as you were in an alliance. And they had very elaborate trade rituals and practices that the French learned to follow. So it wasn't just about, hey, let's meet up and here's what I can sell you and here's how the prices. The French tried that and failed miserably. And so they had to learn to follow this process. And a good example of this is that you had to be respectful. You had to offer gifts. And ultimately follow local customs. There's an example of one of this where a trader came, and a French trader, and he showed up with gifts that were kind of not the best gifts. And the main individual from the local tribe that was trading with him was offended and, basically said, forget that, this is what you show. So the French guy says, sorry, I am so sorry. What can I do to make it up? And what he had to do to make it up was let them on the ship where they got to take whatever they wanted. Then the relationship was repaired, and then they could go on to trade. And this was a lucrative enough business that it was worth it for the French to do so. Of course, one of the things that, how this works out then, of course, is that you end up with much better relations between the French and the Indians than the Spanish or English have. And again, because of one, they were small in size, so they're not threatening, that they don't have a small number of permanent settlements. And they tended to be more respectful and follow traditions and customs of Indians. Now, this wasn't because they necessarily saw them as equal. It was because, you know, this was necessary. The French could be just as racist as the Spanish or English in their view towards the Native Americans. But ultimately, their structure of colonization afforded a much more peaceful existence between the two groups than the others. And this ultimately was seen as a way that you could a cultural exchange between the two groups of the French gave, here it was, a cultural exchange. Right, because it changed, and there still was negative impact from the French as far as what they introduced to the Native Americans in trade. But the idea of the cultural exchange is that the French provided goods and culture to the Native Americans. And B, the Native Americans provided goods and culture to the French. Right? It's like how trade, you know, I guess essentially should work in that sense of the idea that you're getting a rather equal exchange of goods and transaction between the two groups. And again, it wasn't necessarily because they thought that this was the, you know, everyone should be treated equally and we ultimately should respect and honor their cultures. It really was because of how their structure of they weren't there permanently. The men were there for part of the year. They weren't ever looking to settle, so you didn't have the conflict for land and grabbing of land because they weren't expanding. You weren't having constant stream of ships of French individuals coming and moving onto your territory and taking your land and raping and killing your men and women. They didn't have the resources to be able to do that anyways. And because of wanting the furs, they did. Now, of course, one of the consequences of the fur trade was that it created warfare between various Native American tribes, and it did seriously depopulate. Here, we'll put this as the consequences, and this is where we'll end here. Consequences of fur trade do have some negative things that are important to talk about. The first is that it created conflict between various Native American tribes. And why it did this is because as they continued to hunt for beavers, largely was beaver pelts. Right, they actually depopulated the area of beavers. And so they had to go further in, which meant various tribes going into other tribes' territory, which led to conflict and war. And then, of course, the other very negative thing was a massive depopulation of the area of beaver pelts because the demand far outreached what the supply could manage in that area or had ever been when they had been hunting beavers just for the Native Americans in the area. And these were serious consequences. You also had some serious consequences with alcohol and guns, as well as, which actually you could do here, a dependence on European goods. So there were negative consequences, but they weren't the direct physical confrontations, the direct attacks and assaults. Rather, some of them are natural consequences of introducing new cultures and trade, and one being put a little bit more indebted to the other as far as how they use supplies, and they couldn't make their own certain European supplies. and yet became used to them, and it was hard to go back when you had metal pots and pans versus the old ways that they were doing things. And it did impact the local cultures and Native Americans in there in a very negative way. So the French colonization wasn't all like fluffy great by any means, and it certainly had negative consequences for the Native Americans in the area, but it was never as violent as Spanish and never as conflict ridden as the English will be because of their style of colonization.